Hey, it's Professor Wham doing the recording of this third article of mine. And yes, the texts for the other articles are still in process, so those will be uploaded at some point. I will have a full-time job and I do other things, so it's difficult for me to get all of this stuff together. This is not something that I do for a living, so it's relegated to the leisure times of my life. But this particular article that I wrote was inspired by an article that one of my professors wrote. It was actually a presentation that she gave that was called Wounds Over Wounds, Christianity, Pain, and Religious Experience. And it dealt principally with the politics of injury and stigmata among women Christian mystics in the late medieval period in Europe. And it was an interesting article, and it inspired me, basically. And the title of this, Their Tender Mercies Were as Cruelties, this actually refers to a statement that was made by a woman who was recording her experience as an Indian captive. I believe it was Mary Rowland. Indian captivity narratives are really considered to be one of the first distinctively American forms of literature. And there was an intense sort of politics in pain, or politics with pain, or about pain and painful experience that sort of presages the politics of pain that you might find in abduction narratives and other American narratives of trauma, which are quite distinct. There's actually an academic literature about this now, and this paper was written almost 20 years ago. But this particular presentation was never published in the form that I saw it in. It later on became incorporated into a larger book about stigmatics, and comparing the experiences of stigmatics in the medieval period to the phenomenon of stigmatism, or having the stigmatic injuries of Christ among current or more modern, more recent Christian mystics. I'm trying to talk here. I'm hot. It's hot here today. Anyway, so that's what inspired this particular article, because I noticed that there were some similarities, at least in terms of the relationship between pain and the relationship between sort of legitimacy. The more pain someone endures, the more pain or trauma that one has experienced, the more real the experience is. And I've often wondered whether that's the reason for that is really in the United States, is really because in America there is a kind of Christian cultural underpinning underneath everything, which sort of privileges pain as an exemplar of truth in certain ways. But in any case, these are some of the other books that I used as foundational texts. I will name some other texts as I go in this article. But some of these texts are The Body in Pain, Trauma and Recovery, The Culture of Pain, and then Serial Killers, this book by Mark Seltzer, which really talks about the construction of the narrative of serial killers. It's not about serial killers themselves. It's not like a true crime book. It's more a book about how a lot of the individuals who were serial killers in the United States, how we have developed a narrative around them. for popular entertainment and all kinds of things. Whereas where this is really a very different approach to these kinds of crimes than you would have seen even 150 years ago. Where 150 years ago, these people, if they were caught, they would be hunted down and tortured and summarily killed. There would be no romanticizing about what they did. Their behavior would simply be seen as evil. And now we kind of, in a weird way, we're fascinated by them. But in any case, this book, Serial Killers, is really about a kind of romantic attachment to certain types of pain and its relationship to power. So, and truth. So that's part of the reason why I used it. But anyway, so the title of this paper was Their Tender Mercies Were as Cruelties, the Liminal Politics of Pain and Alien Abduction Testimony. So there's actually a lot of stories in this particular article. In 1993, I attended the Rocky Mountain UFO Conference as part of my research for a master's thesis. This particular annual conference, which is held at the University of Wyoming in Laramie and organized by Professor of Psychology Emeritus Dr. Leo Sprinkle, of course this no longer occurs, I don't think, is geared primarily toward UFO contactees and abductees and features public testimonial forums, group encounters, and private hypnotherapy counseling sessions for individuals who are, quote, just coming out, and they actually use that terminology, as UFO abductees, contactees. Since many of the groups were off limits to individuals who do not claim to be experiencers, I spent most of my time, when not engaged in more formal interviews, witnessing the testimonial forums, which had much the same atmosphere as tent revival meetings. Individuals who had never before told their encounter stories were encouraged to stand up before the capacity crowd and share their experiences. Others whose stories had been told gave updates on their ongoing contacts, sharing details of living with an implant, quote unquote, and, quote, what to do if you think your child is being abducted, unquote. Apparently, some of these individuals had been coming to the conference for years, and their ongoing exploits were familiar to many in the audience, who, of course, obviously were repeat attendees. I obtained a number of informal interviews at these gatherings, and several testimonials still stand out in my memory. Among these is the woman whom I refer to in my notes as the wife seeking pain. She had been coming to this conference for many years, and the regular attendees in the audience knew her story. Her husband, a structural engineer with an excellent reputation and career, had been experiencing abduction episodes for well over a decade. Over time, the abduction experiences had begun to erode his ability to work, although he still struggled to maintain several projects. The abduction experiences had adversely affected his mental and physical health to the point where he lived in almost constant anxiety, pain, and fear. This in turn had strained their marriage to the point where, after many years of struggling, the two of them were coming to the conclusion that, as sad as it seemed, the abduction experiences had irreparably damaged their relationship. Tearfully, the woman, in a heartbreaking confession, admitted that for many years she had simply not believed her husband when he disappeared for sometimes days at a time, only to reappear completely disoriented, looking as though he hadn't bathed at all during the interim, yet completely lacking any beard growth, which for her would have been consistent if he had simply wandered off in a fugue state. Slowly, because she found no evidence of infidelity despite the evidence of a private investigator, and because of his obvious mental and physical distress, she began to believe him, although his intermittent disappearances had continued to cause her terrible concern. She wanted to help him cope, but he often kept his terrors to himself, not wanting her to shoulder what he considered to be his burden. He often suffered from amnesia, insomnia, depression, and bouts of severe paranoia. He had sought professional help, but no physiological or obvious psychological reason for his condition could be determined, and thus no particular treatment was deemed appropriate except for the general advice to, quote, get some rest from the stress of your job, unquote. Finally, in a desperate bid to save her marriage, she began to wonder if there was any way that she could induce the UFO abductors to pick her up, to subject her to mind control, body paralysis, and pointless medical probing in order that she might understand more fully her husband's trauma, by herself becoming a victim of his abductors. There were many in the audience, apparently, who knew of her struggle and her attempts to contact and even challenge the abductors to take her. The evening that I saw her speak, she revealed to the crowd that she had begun to have experiences which indicated to her that she might be getting the UFO abductors' attention. She reported several instances of missing time, bodily aches and pains which were not normal for her, and the causes of which she had been unable to determine. Many in the audience cheered for her, and she quietly concluded with the hope that perhaps her apparently successful efforts at getting abducted would provide the basis for rebuilding a saving of her marriage, in which she had invested so much. This account, poignant and troubling, has remained in my mind as the most appropriate place to begin when considering the vitally important role that pain plays in many UFO testimonial narratives. This is particularly true when one considers that despite the fact many UFO accounts of abduction and contact do not involve remembered traumatic events or infliction of bodily pain, the traumatic, painful UFO encounter is the narrative that is most frequently told at the level of commercial media, and I think that is still largely the case. It is not simply that pain sells in a commercial sense. The dynamic is more complicated than that. It is more accurate to say that narratives containing pain are more convincing. They seem more true. Furthermore, to paraphrase Elaine Scarry, testimonials of pain in UFO abduction counts are attempts to render a painful individual life experience visible. The woman who sought to share in her husband's pain, quote unquote, by seeking a painful, even traumatic experience herself in order to stave off what she considered to be the apparently more severe pain of losing her marriage, was attempting to reach across an epistemological gap that cannot be bridged. Knowing his experiences firsthand, according to her testimony, would nullify the destruction of his ability to communicate to her the nature of his pain. He would no longer have to try to explain. In fact, she assumed that having the abduction herself would ensure that she could come to understand the inexpressible nature of her husband's anguish. Furthermore, the telling of her story of pain within the context of a supportive community, the story of both a failing marriage and attempts to achieve a level of understanding her husband by actively seeking the source and agent of his reported pain, made meaningful and real a relationship process that was at once confusing and obscure and understandably difficult to convey. My continued experiences interviewing individuals who claim alien abduction at conferences and private gatherings has rendered many additional examples of painful abduction narratives couched in terms of identity and performance. According to the commonly accepted social narrative of alien abduction, as articulated by the very public figures Bud Hopkins, John Mack, and David Jacobs, two of whom, of course, many of you know are no longer with us, few abductees are understood to be actually seeking the experiences they report. According to this accepted scenario, even UFO contactees, abductees who report their experiences as relatively benign would rather not have such experiences at all. Even the most positive experiences are often reported to be confusing, unnerving, inopportune, and inconvenient. And this is a refrain that is echoed, of course, by abductees such as Whitley Strieber and the independent investigator Kenneth Ring in his Omega Project, Near-Death Experiences, UFO Encounters in the Mind at Large. There is at least psychological uncertainty and often pronounced anxiety about the implications of the experience. To paraphrase a UFO investigator friend in Puerto Rico, none of the current explanations for the accounts which attribute UFO contact abduction experience to a cultural source, context, mental or imaginal aberration, government intervention and conspiracy, none of these are really feel about this alternatives. You know, whether it's a cultural context, a mental or aberration, or something literal, or a government conspiracy. None of these are like, none of these are nice experiences, right? Even the nuts and bolts explanation is literal objective fact and provides little existential comfort other than it takes such accounts at face value. It is therefore an interesting phenomenon which describes the attempt by some members of the abduction community to seek and perform the agony of such a traumatic narrative. In my experience, it appears that most abductees or abductees-to-be choose to believe in the literal nature of their experiences simply because, from their way of thinking, that choice seems to be the least complicated of the options available, not because they prefer their experiences to be literal. In light of the dearth of explanations or theories that can both explain these reports and assume the reporters are not necessarily fanatics or well-meaning but horribly misled or ignorant people, it is then relatively easy to understand why the reports of painful experience are seized upon. If, as Morris argues, this is David Morris, during his discussion of the Marquis de Sade as the painful exemplar of the modern, postmodern experience of pain, the secular truth of the body is signified by pain, then pain is the sign of the real. Or, in another context, when describing American wound culture and its contribution to the construction of the serial killer, Mark Seltzer observes that, quote, the wound or pain is no longer the mark, the stigmata of the heroic or sacred. It is the icon or stigma of the everyday openness and vulnerability of the body. One might also add to this that pain is also the icon of the possible powerless vulnerability of the body, where, to summarize Foucault, and this is in his Birth of the Clinic, the disease or pain becomes the sign of embodied assurance. Or as Foucault puts it, signs and symptoms are and say the same thing, the difference being that the sign says the same thing that is precisely the symptom. The presence of pain relieves doubt, provides an ontological, epistemological certainty about the event or experience, namely alien abduction, that society only marginally accepts. Pain, in a sense, is easier to accept. We don't call people in pain liars. At most, we might think they misunderstand or misidentify their experiences. Most importantly, for individuals telling and listening to accounts of alien contact and abduction, pain itself doesn't lie. If it hurts, then something happened. Therefore, pain becomes the touchstone, the test of what is believable to many about these accounts. Thus, it is accounts of pain that make it into the popular media, and it is, for the most part, narratives of pain that contactees, abductees tell each other, despite any additional positive effects or conditions. And then I make a note here that this, of course, is not intended to deny or diminish the various economic and social factors that might make it profitable and sensational to focus on transmission of painful or traumatic abduction stories. I am merely attempting to emphasize that such economic factors cannot fully explicate why abductees may concentrate on painful stories when speaking to each other, not speaking to the media or the press, but speaking to each other. Moreover, contrary to Scari's contention that pain, physiological and often psychological, shatters the verbal articulations of identity, pain is precisely the gap that UFO abductees and their audiences attempt to cross, finding a shared identity in what hurts them, and what of that pain can be engendered and understood in another. The question, of course, is whether they succeed in their endeavor to bridge this gap, something that Scari will deny, but many transformed witnesses of UFO encounter will affirm can be done. This brief essay, then, is an attempt to understand the way in which pain in UFO abduction accounts is rendered meaningful in the telling. It is also an attempt to make visible a range of individual and community experiences that are currently dismissed in many scientific and academic communities as products of cultural hysteria, paranoia, or wish-fulfilling fantasy. This is not to say that I just accept such accounts at face value. I most certainly am not what some would simplistically or cynically term either a believer or a skeptic. In this world of reported terrorists, genocide, serial murderers, tortured political prisoners, natural disasters, race and abuse victims in each newscast, it is not surprising, and perhaps might seem redundant, that a cultural narrative should emerge which features aliens from the unknown territory of space, gratuitously hunting down human specimens for a genetic harvesting venture. It's so weird how nothing has changed, right? However, as David Hufford has pointed out in his brilliant The Terror That Comes in the Night, which, by the way, is still a great book, if you can get it, the cultural source hypothesis does not adequately explain all the features of these experiences, especially the role and constitution of memory as it relates to identity and narrative construction. Contrary to Showalter's assertion, this was an individual who was looking at the phenomenon of hysterical cultural narratives. A simple comparison between a variety of hysterical narratives does not in and of itself demonstrate the sources which inform these cultural constructions, particularly when the real and imaginal elements of such intertwine. And this is a book, Elaine Showalter, Histories, Hysterical Epidemics, and Modern Media. Showalter's text makes some interesting arguments concerning the interpenetrating nature of media and personal performance in the making of culture hysterias, but she makes no distinction between the nature and levels of evidence found in each of the narratives that she encounters. So, for example, the hysteria in the mid to late 90s of Gulf War syndrome, Showalter reports as having been complicated with the emergent knowledge made public after Showalter published her text that some Allied troops in the Gulf War may well have been exposed to a number of chemical or biological substances. She basically looks at those reports, and some of you may remember them, as just being hysterical narratives, that there was nothing to them, that they were all crazy. However, when you read these now, and even when I was reading them in the early 2000s, her contentions read more like reductive dismissals of such narratives, closing off points of inquiry that might be made between these cultural accounts and other narratives of capture, separation, and torture, such as the Indian captivity narrative. At the same time, simple reference to postmodern cultural alienation, quote unquote, does not delineate the delicate territory of what I have come to term the liminal politics of pain narratives. So another way of nuancing this concern can be found in Donald Braid's discussion of the experience of following, that dynamic of witnessing a narrative which deeply resonates with one's own experience. He wrote an article about this called Personal Narrative and Experiential Meaning, in which he's describing that phenomenon which we've all experienced, where you are listening to someone even tell a remarkably bizarre story, but somehow it resonates with you personally and helps you understand personal meaning in your own life. And some of these narratives can be even bizarre, that he's arguing that this is an important component of folklore, basically. Now, by pain narrative, I refer to those testimonial narratives which seek not only to tell a story, but to convince the reader or listener of its veracity by attempting to invoke a visceral or imaginal grasp or understanding of the experience in the audience, a little version of the experience, if you will. This is similar to the narrative technique described by scholars of American sentimental or Gothic literature of the 19th century, and more specifically to the late or second phase of the Indian captivity narrative, which basically those narratives, that literary genre ran from about 1750 to about 1900. Listeners or readers are called upon more as witnesses, in which they are not merely being persuaded that something about the story is true, but are led to a truth, a new psychological territory, by virtue of their experiencing the telling as a transformative moment in their own lives. The role of witness is also regarded as the appropriate epistemological role to be taken by psychologists or psychiatrists who specialize in trauma therapy. And these, of course, are dealing usually with victims of sexual assault, incest, natural disaster, or political terrorism, in which classically the claims and recollections of patients in pain are not challenged, but witnessed. And Judith Herman actually talks about this. And her book is rich in implications regarding the relationship between chronic trauma and identity formation. By politics, I mean these testimonials always take place in environments of social controversy, and this is particularly true of UFO abduction accounts. There is a stake in believing or not believing. One will be held accountable to some authority. One will have to take a stand. By liminal, I mean that these testimonials, when experienced as persuasive, produce a rupture in individual understanding. And an individual moves from one psychological territory to another, the account being the liminal boundary between these imaginal terrains. What was once considered questionable is now possible. Ontological and epistemological worlds shift or sometimes traumatically collide. As such, painful narratives can comprise what Braid has referred to as an experientially meaningful mode of knowledge, insofar as the given narrative is followed by the listener, by the experience of the listener. In addition, these accounts, at least for individuals who experience them liminally, often promise hidden information, similar to testimonials of visionary illumination found in religious literature. The role of expressed pain often becomes the most important motive force in the public performance of UFO abduction narratives. For if the physiological and psychological anguish can be expressed and conveyed convincingly, then the account of the UFO abduction itself can be experienced as a possibility. The self-reflexive nature of this process is best described by Bloom. Politics of pain, both as it relates to the bonding with others and to the management of the self, circles around the image of the pained body and affirms both the bond and the alienation of the perceiving individual, quote unquote. And this is from Gothic Bodies, The Politics of Pain in Romantic Fiction. This phenomenon has been described extensively in psychiatric and psychological literature as it pertains to individuals suffering from trauma induced by torture, sexual, emotional, or physical abuse, natural disasters, and rape. However, in this case, pain expressed is at least partially intended to convince individuals in the reality of reported experiences that are not accepted as objective or official knowledge. We're talking, again, about abductions and contacts. This is, in fact, why most of the well-known investigators, Mack, Hopkins, Stryber, Jacobs, and a number of others since then, have depended so heavily on the psychological model of the traumatized victim. Namely, just as most people 50 years ago didn't believe in the common reality of child abuse and rape, and yet accept most accounts as true today, so too will most accept UFO abduction contact as possibly true in time to come. And in fact, Bud Hopkins says this explicitly in many of his presentations. As examples of this dynamic at work, this essay will explore the politics of pain in the UFO abduction from two vantage points. First, we will briefly compare the classic UFO abduction narrative in America with two other capture narratives, the bound bodies located in stories of Indian captivity, and the predominant narrative of bodily pain and spiritual redemption found in pre-Reformation Christian communities. These comparisons will be made with attention to the politics of pain in each narrative type. I will not be arguing that these different narratives are the same stories in different form, that they reveal a continuity, or that they express the same meanings of pain. In fact, in some instances, the meanings are precisely reversed. The purpose of the comparison is to facilitate a wider view of the politics of pain, in which the specific meanings of pain in the UFO abduction community can be seen in sharp relief. Secondly, we will then concisely discuss two recent publications in the UFO community which deal with the topic of alien implants, which those sort of fell out of vogue for a little while, but they've kind of come back. I've seen that. They've kind of come back. The outstanding feature of the alien implant literature as a subtext of abduction literature is its emphasis on ongoing physical pain, impairment, or insecurity wrought by having been tagged, quote unquote, by aliens during an encounter. This literature is problematic and elusive, but it is the current obsession of many in the UFO communities, as it is believed that these implants and the discomfort they produce will provide definitive proof of alien intervention in human affairs. So according to Stephen Broom, the politics of pain in Western cultures can be understood as expressing itself in three interpenetrating levels. A, the level of cultural interest in inscriptions of both personal and group materializations of class and economic identity. B, the level of epistemological definitions of the body-mind complex, a concern that is generated from the first level and emphasizes the political implications of power relations or the possibility of difference in the political significance and use of pain. And C, the level of pain within the context of larger political concerns, wherein narratives of pain are used to exploit, express, or control overt external political and institutional hegemonies. So in her excellent manuscript, Wounds Over Wounds, Christianity, Pain, and Religious Experience, Sandra Zimdar-Schwartz, this is my professor and her paper, traces the evolution of pain narratives that informed various Western Christian communities from late antiquity to the period generally known as the European Renaissance. By looking at the stories of early Christian martyrs, medieval accounts of visionary excursions to the realms of the afterlife, and the accounts of stigmatics and other Christian mystics, Zimdar-Schwartz illustrates that, quote, the experience of pain for Christians has usually been associated with healing. Indeed, pain has often been linked with a promise of healing, if not for oneself, then for others, unquote. This healing was not necessarily associated with physical cure. In early Christian martyrology, significant healing focused on the soul, in which the presence of God manifested itself in the bodies of tortured Christian proselytes as either an insensibility to pain or the ability to endure extraordinary inflicted anguish. This ability to bear wounding, what Zimdar-Schwartz calls the wounds over wounds, is as proof of a divine presence manifesting in physical symptoms or lack thereof, is proof of a divine presence manifesting in physical is a theme taken up during the late Middle Ages among those victim souls who became identified as stigmatics or flagellants, bearing the wounds of Christ and the sins of the world in order to attest to the presence of God as embodied in and upon their often self-tortured flesh. So their ability to endure pain was proof, basically, that Christ was in them. I'll put it that way. Zimdar-Schwartz provides a 19th century account of Louise, a young female stigmatic whose wounding were not conclusively proved to be self-induced, causing some scientists to conclude that her wounding was of divine origin, who was subjected to cruel and violent experiments by the scientist Lebevre in order that he might establish the nature of Louise's stigmata. In this instance, it was purely the ability to bear inflicted pain that defined such individuals as God-infected or God-inspired. This is a construction of meaningful pain that persists on a continuum, which includes a present-day quasi-comatose child in New Jersey who is seen by many pious Christians as a modern victim soul, and can be expanded to include religious fundamentalists of every religion or ideology who engage in public or private displays of austerity, deprivation, and in some cases self-mutilation and suicide. You can see this happening in some of the more radical sects of Shiism, for example, where during certain festivals that commemorate the battles between the early Shia and Sunni combatants, you'll see people, devotees, literally flaying themselves with knives or beating themselves. And there are many examples of Christians, especially during Holy Week, of certain fundamentalist sects that actually engage in forms of self-crucifixion. In these cases, what is good for the soul, namely the declarations of faith against a secular world and the bonding of such faithful individuals together by virtue of shared pain, may be bad for the body. Such pain as endured by the body is considered to be of little consequence if it can prevent or heal a soul that has been corrupted by the materialistic, read bodily enticements of Western secular culture. Zimdar Schwartz provides another example of how this meaningful construction of pain is documented in medieval vision narratives, in which individuals are taken on otherworldly journeys by saints or angels and shown the joys of heaven and the torments of hell. These stories are often clearly didactic, and in the example Zimdar Schwartz provides, the visionary Thurkill is shown in excruciating detail how the spiritual corruption of the soul results in repetitive bodily torments in hell. Namely, he learns that people begin to construct the iron chairs in which they will be eternally crushed, burnt, dismembered, and reassembled while they are alive, unquote. Yet by following church teaching, practicing confession, and regular tithing, these torments can be mitigated or avoided altogether. What is striking about these stories is how the spiritual corruption of the soul, as signified by sinful action, is duplicated in the form of punishment administered. A judge guilty of accepting bribes is forced to eat burning money. A prideful man is given rich clothes to wear that stick to his body once they are ignited by gleeful demons in their theater. In the afterlife, according to these pain narratives, a tortured body is the sign of sin committed and a corrupted soul. Utilizing Broom's analysis, it is possible to detect the various levels of the liminal politics of pain in these Christian narratives. In the martyrology and the victim soul narratives, particularly in the 19th century case of Louise, the presence of God, as signified by the insensibility of the body to inflicted pain, expresses the triumph of a spiritual authority, in this case the church over secular powers, namely the prosecuting Romans or the skeptical scientists, or in the case of Louise, the scientist who, of course, was torturing her. Stories of the martyrs or of victim souls were and are often used as examples of piety and exhortation in Christian communities to bolster the resolve of the faithful during difficult times, or presently in the face of secular meaninglessness. Moreover, such stories emphasize and reinscribe the central Christian theological precept that the body, however important, is but a vehicle for the soul, and as such can be, indeed sometimes must be, sacrificed for the good of the soul in the hereafter. The vision narratives, such as the vision of Thurkill, also emphasize the central political and economic importance of the church, while literally inverting the meaning of the body-mind complex. So the body itself, as the locus of torture in hell, is absolutely central in establishing the meaning and consequences of moral and immoral action. Furthermore, these stories underscore the interdependence of cultural and even economic classes of all Christians or citizens during the Middle Ages. Thurkill, a rural laborer, is shown not only how the rich will be punished, but how his own misdeeds will condemn him as well. In hell, all bodies of all condemned people are potentially equal in that their punishments match their crimes, not their social status. Now, on the surface, Indian captivity narratives appear to bear little resemblance to the Christian narratives of pain already described. Yet, according to Gary Ebersol, and this is in his study of Indian captivity texts captured by texts, the politics of pain in these narratives are an essential feature of their meaningful telling. To remind the reader, Indian captivity narratives comprised a genre in American literature which developed from the time of the Puritan settlement to the beginning of the 20th century. And actually a lot of the very early pulps and comic books featured elements of the Indian captivity narrative, with many variations. The basic narrative simply describes the adventures, tortures, ordeals, and assimilation or escapes of mainly white settlers, occasionally blacks, who were captured or abducted by Indians during raids, wars, or collecting expeditions. There is currently, and this was 20 years ago, a burgeoning critical literature which is examining these narratives from every angle, including race, gender, economic, and literary thematic concerns. Ebersole concerns himself, among other related topics, very specifically to the politics of pain in these narratives as, quote, the exposure of the body as a site of suffering and pain, and it makes claims on others that are ontological, epistemological, and moral in nature. As Ebersole describes it, the meaning of pain in these narratives is expressed in two distinct, although overlapping, phases. The first phase, represented most commonly by the captivity of Mary Rowlandson and dating to the Puritan settlements in the 17th century, inscribes a Puritan Christian understanding of the body in pain, in which physical affliction was, quote, sometimes understood to be a sign of election, of divine concern for one's spiritual condition, unquote. Rowlandson annotates her narration of pain with biblical references, juxtaposing her recalled torments with scriptural remembrances. Her account becomes not only a report of difficulties endured by a white woman in the savage wilderness, but a living otherworld journey in which her past misdeeds are weighed against her recalled, tormented circumstances. As such, her narrative also operates in much the same manner as Thurkill's vision, namely, as the torments of hell can be visited on anyone, so can anyone, in this case any good Puritan, unquote, be captured by the savage Indians who, even during moments of seeming concern for their captive, inflict anguish and torment. Many of these early narratives contained directives which advocated their use in public worship and in private devotional practice, as exhortation and meditations on personal moral practice in the face of uncertainty and trial. The second phase of Indian captivity narrative developed in the mid-18th century and became the single most popular form of sentimental literature during the 19th century. This narrative form expanded and became a principal literary vehicle which expressed and inscribed everything from white American gender constructions, government policies concerning non-whites, particularly indigenous peoples in America, recording the vanishing frontier to the simple making of money. In these narratives, the specific meaning of pain varies with each account, although often multiple meanings are inscribed. The politics of pain in these later narratives rarely had theological overtones, rather was embodied in the heroic, suffering frontiersman, the tragically violated white woman, or the insensible savage whose inability to feel pain or identify with the pain of others was a sign of a degraded humanity rather than of divine election or intervention. Often these narratives were intended, through the use of sensational and explicit embellishments on the tortures inflicted upon the bodies of the captives, to produce a liminal, visceral moment of sympathy. This sympathy or fellow feeling, as described by Edmund Burke, the conservative commentator and critic from the late 18th and early 19th century, was similar in intention to the goal of 18th and 19th century sentimental literature generally, in that it performed, quote, the dual function of telling us, the readers, what to feel and what not to feel politically, unquote. At the same time, Indian captivities, with their full allotment of described tortures, scalpings, running the gauntlet, body mutilations, burning, tattooing, etc., and anxieties, operated as sentimental literature generally, being instruments of cultural self-definition, quote unquote, which could go a long way towards influencing government and business policies on, quote, the Indian question, unquote. The stereotypes of indigenous peoples, white men, women, and children all operated to convey the values and anxieties of Euro-American civilization during the colonization of the North American continent, as well as exemplars of how some individuals responded to seeming Job-like situations. In fact, comparing one's capture to Job was very common. To read the stories were to edify oneself as to the opportunities inherent in standing up to suffering that might be endured when facing others less civilized. The pleasure in narrating one's personal story came from the knowledge that the, quote, moral sensibilities of the audience can be sharpened and instructed through the effective transaction involved in the act of narration, unquote. The audience can become more tender-hearted and humane, unlike the unfeeling Indian brutes whose tenderest mercies were as cruelties, to refined Euro-American sensibilities. As the 19th century progressed, Indian captivities became ever more heroic, presaging the conquering of a continent and its indigenous peoples through the examples of a few brave white men and women who suffered and endured while meeting the savageries of the native population face to face. UFO abduction narratives in the U.S. share certain features with both preceding capture and pain narratives, but the meaning of pain in UFO testimonial communities has a very different emphasis. Communities who shared in the tortures of the Christian martyrs or in the visions of their mystics did not have to be convinced of the existence of hell or of the spiritual realm. Moreover, even if most Indian captivities were fictional by the late 19th century, no one who read them doubted that Indian captivities had occurred. UFO abductees tell their painful stories in a very different cultural field, in a fickle, uncertain place, where their accounts can be met with outright skepticism, derision, and or commodity sensationalism. Whatever the source or ontological status of the reported experiences, there is no doubt that many abductees fear becoming targets of skeptics, believers, and economic opportunists alike. And I quote here, or I note here, the author Ida Cannonberg in her book UFOs and the Psychic Factor. She was a colleague of Dr. Leo Sprinkle. And I mention here that my experience and that of other serious researchers, contrary to the belief of many, most abductees were extremely reluctant to talk to researchers or have their names used in connection with any publication. And in fact, in the book UFOs and the Psychic Factor, which was published in 1992, Ida Cannonberg devotes an entire chapter to the techniques of avoiding researchers and news operatives who simply want a story. So as a result, the painful UFO abduction narrative operates not only as a narrative instrument which may influence the perceptions and belief commitments of an audience, it seeks to operate as a critique and expression of cultural traces that dominant hegemonies may deny or seek to sublimate. By insisting on the painful realities they experience, UFO abductees claim truth with the most powerful sign of the dominating epistemology of the real in American culture, namely the marked and damaged body, what could be described following Mark Seltzer as the body of the wound. So in the mainstream governing UFO abduction account, abductees claim that they have experienced being forcibly removed from familiar surroundings, from their bedroom, their car, their living room, by usually non-human entities who paralyze their bodies and often their minds and relocate them to unfamiliar spaces, namely spaceships, underground caves, sometimes hidden military installations. In some cases, less commonly, regular humans, often of seeming military status, assist the aliens in their capture. In most of the published narratives, at least at the time when I was writing this, the individuals are given a rather invasive medical exam. Fluid and tissue samples, most common blood, ova, sperm, are taken, and sometimes the individual experiences a mental test or a sexual assault. And we're talking about mainstream accounts at the time, about 20 years ago. In the most common written account, the individual is returned more or less to the location from which they were taken, and some form of hypnotic suggestion is given to the person, resulting in the perception of missing time. In order to recall or understand the experience, the prospective abductee is generally referred to an investigator that utilizes hypnosis. Although the use of regressive hypnotic recall to reconstruct the abduction experience has been sharply and increasingly criticized in many of these cases, most of the prominent UFO abductee investigators still insist on its usefulness. And again, this was 20 years ago. That has changed some. The resulting testimony contains elements that resemble the otherworldly journey of Thurkill, the dramatic emotional trauma recalled by those captured by Indians, and the most distasteful moments experienced by many of us when we visit the doctor for an exam or medical test. Capturing aliens are often described as controlling, cold, emotionless, or as uncomprehending of human terror, unaware that their operations may cause pain. Sometimes they are described as sadistic, unaware that their operations may cause pain. Let me read this again. Sometimes they are described as sadistic, aware of the trauma they induce, clinically interested in the effects of their operations on flesh and psyche. Despite the fact that they are understood to be technologically superior to humans, as Indians were not in captivity narratives, aliens are often depicted as being morally inferior or inscrutable, as evidenced by a cyborg clinical brutality. They probe, they remove, they tag, like scientists with a specimen, unlike the accounts of violently emotional but physically insensible and unrefined Indians in the captivity narratives. By the way, I meant to mention that one of the earliest discussions of academic discussions of the problem of using regressive hypnosis in alien abduction accounts was discussed by Jody Dean in Aliens in America, Conspiracy Cultures from Outer Space to Cyberspace. In many written accounts, the details of capture, and these are abduction accounts, of capture, medical examination, sperm or egg extraction are recounted in harrowing detail. Long needles or probes are used to pierce membranes in the nose or ears. Razor-sharp cups are used to scoop out tissue samples. The most sensitive parts of the body, eyes, ears, genitals, behind the knees, are favored targets. Some female abductees report air being introduced into their uterus. Quote, "This is weird. I feel like somebody's blowing up my side. This is stupid. Something hurts. I feel like I'm pregnant. Something is real hard in my stomach on the side." And these are quotations and descriptions from David Jacobs' book and John Mack's book. Abductions, Human Encounters with Aliens, and the Threat, the Secret Agenda, What Aliens Really Want. Others report being forced through mind control to mate with other humans or aliens, producing hybrid children that are shown to them in subsequent abductions. Still other women report that fetuses are stolen from them, pregnancies terminated due to the intervention of alien abductors interested in a human-alien eugenics program. We've all heard these stories. While being examined, many abductees report that they are subjected to mental tests or telepathically shown horrific pictures of environmental collapse, nuclear war, or the images of, quote, earth shuddering in anguish, crying, weeping at the stupidity of humans losing contact with the inner soul of their being, unquote. These are aspects of the abduction narrative that most resemble the otherworldly journey feature of other painful narratives. Abductees who report these tests and visions react much as Thurkill did when reflecting upon his visions of hell, or Mary Rowlandson when recalling her captivity. They reflect upon their misdeeds. They report that their lives change in significant ways. For example, one abductee abruptly changed her eating habits and became vegetarian after her abductors tried to force her to kill a small animal they had also captured. It is not uncommon for abductees to leave family, faith, or job as a result of their experiences. For most abductees, the UFO contact community, which inscribes knowledge of the real onto that which is known primarily through experience, namely of pain, becomes the location where they reconstruct family and identity based around the shared experiences of contact anguish. This would seem all too fantastic, except that the emotional content and impact of the reported experiences, whether reproduced by hypnosis or recalled spontaneously, are compelling, even to many of the most seasoned reporters and scholars. John Mack, the Pulitzer Prize Harvard professor and psychiatrist, was so tremendously impacted by the witnessing of painful UFO abduction narratives that he flouted political convention and threatened his tenure by openly pursuing a phenomenon, quote, that could not be explained psychiatrically, yet for him was simply not possible within the framework of the Western scientific worldview, unquote. But Hopkins and David Jacobs, two of the most prominent UFO abduction investigators, both admit that it was the emotional impact of the reports, the seeming trauma and anguish for which they could not account, which provided the, quote, intuition, and that's exactly the word that Bud Hopkins uses, the liminal moment of transition, that abduction reporters were not lying. And according to the logic of liminal pain performance, what is not a lie, namely the pain, must be the real signified, must mean that something is true about what they are reporting. And I note here that most UFO abductee investigators find it necessary to provide introductory autobiographical essays at the beginning of their texts in which they provide a narrative describing the genesis and evolution of their interest in the topic at hand. All the popular published investigators report a moment of liminal transition in which they intuitively perceived the UFO abductee accounts were simply literally true. And you can read Hopkins' account in Missing Time, Jacob's account in Secret Life. Now this brings us to the topic of alien implants, the tags with which many abductees claim they have been marked. The UFO contact community has asserted for years that there are those among them who have been permanently scarred or implanted with unknown devices as a result of their encounters. None of the physical evidence has been regarded as conclusive, and many of the implants are actually considered to be astral or etheric in nature, namely they're not physical, but existing on super-physical levels of awareness or in other frequencies. However, in the last few years, there has been an intensive effort put forth by some abduction investigators to verify that, at least in some cases, these implants are actual physical unknown objects that can be examined, identified, and removed from the body and subjected to scientific analysis. I need to stop here for a minute and acknowledge that implants are not the only physical evidence that exists in the body. There are a number of other accounts where people report and have been able to demonstrate physical damage, sometimes on an ongoing basis, as a result of their encounter with something inexplicable. Although the two cases that I'm thinking about, the one in Falcon Lake in Canada, he has no memory, that contactee has no memory of being abducted. What he has the memory of is just simply coming into physical contact with the strange object that he saw, and that resulted in the physical injuries and marks on his body, which remained with him until the time he died. Many, many years later, his health was permanently physically affected by his experience. So I'm not going to say that there have not, and obviously the case of the Landrum case, where a group of people in a car were obviously physically affected by something that they saw. I mean, they died of cancers that were the individuals among them who died of cancers that were most likely caused by some kind of radiation that they came in contact with. So there are real examples of people having permanent injury or being marked by encounter with something. But in neither of those cases was there contact with aliens or abduction. So we're talking here about abduction accounts, all right? So, and this is in the early 2000s. Principal among these investigators who were investigating implants is Dr. Roger Lear, a podiatrist whose lifelong obsession with UFOs led to his interest in producing physical evidence of alien intervention on Earth. His book, The Aliens and the Scalpel, 1998, is an exhaustive account of two surgeries which were performed in 1995 on individuals who claimed past abduction experiences and in whom small identified objects had been discovered by X-ray during routine medical exams. The book focuses on the actual surgeries in comprehensive, almost tedious detail, from the background of each individual, Dr. Lear's surgical procedures, to the gory moments of scalpels slicing, blood spurting, and patients wincing. The actual surgical moments are told in such a way as to replicate an experience of encountering the unknown. So, for example, after probing around in a patient's toe for over an hour, the operating surgeons are depicted as shouting with excitement when encountering grayish abnormal material and tissue. The patient jerks his foot in pain while the doctors probe deep inside his toe. In amazement, the doctors call for another local, despite the fact that the patient had been administered only a minimum of local anesthetic and was using hypnosis to try to control the pain. Dr. Lear concludes that the writhing of his patient in pain upon the probing of the object and surrounding tissue is proof of the possible preternatural extraterrestrial origin of the implant prior to any testing of the object. That the removal of the object was painful is enough to prove the possibility that non-humans or aliens were involved. The most remarkable recent publication to stress the importance of alien implants as proof of human-alien interaction is or was the latest literary installment by the well-known UFO abductee and horror fiction writer Whitley Strieber. Whitley Strieber has written extensively on his reported abduction experiences, tracing the effects of the experiences on his life, his relationships, and his financial condition. From the first moments of terror and communion to his visionary prophetic pronouncements in The Secret School, Strieber has gone from feelings of violation and outrage to mystic revelation and ecstasy. However, in his recent, when I was writing this book, Confirmation, and certainly on his current website, Strieber does a seeming about-face and returns to the issues of physical evidence and painful traumatic experience in the attempt to join the ranks of those who insist that the truth regarding these experiences can only be located in personal experience and the traces of those experiences in the painful body. Although in past texts he has insisted that his experiences have been personally transformative and in the main positive, if still somewhat troubling, in Confirmation he appears to backtrack, focusing on the trials endured by individuals who attempt to procure photographic evidence of UFOs and those abductees who share painful narratives. It seems that Strieber has reconsidered and now regards not all UFO abduction experiences as potentially life-affirming and revelatory events. Now, Strieber praises the work of Dr. Lear and relates his own implant experience in which an unidentified nodule on the cartilage of his ear seemed to disappear or dissipate when a doctor attempted to remove it. He states, and this is in chapter 18 of Confirmation, the Hard Evidence of Aliens Among Us, he states that he has come to believe that many humans may be walking around with implants, and that he tells his story in detail because he thinks that a great many people who have strange objects in their body are going to have the experience of getting the objects removed and then being unable to tell for certain what they are. This is a quote. As a result, they will be suffering anxiety and perhaps physical symptoms caused by objects over which they have no control and for which no cure or treatment might be found. In other words, potential emotional, physical trauma may result from unknown objects found or suspected in human bodies whose origin is unknown, the effects of which cannot be proved. Strieber wraps up his account of implants by recalling those abductees who remember being tagged by aliens with the assistance of human military personnel, whom he implies may be covert intelligence operatives within the U.S. government. Then Strieber summarizes the pain of the abductee by reminding the reader of all the existential anxieties which many individuals face in dominant American culture, namely rumors of government conspiracy, economic and political manipulations by corporations, family disintegration, and community destruction. The pain and trauma of the UFO abductee is related to the pain of a dying, violent, self-devouring culture with no guarantee of light or darkness ahead. As he puts it, quote, anyone in this society who isn't at least somewhat paranoid probably isn't entirely sane, unquote. Now, I do have to mention here that there was an online source, UFO Seek, which offered a humorous critique of Dr. Lear's ability to spot or identify an alien implant, and it was called Alien Implants and Foreign Bodies, by the pricking of my thumbs, something wicked this way comes. So if you're able to find this, it's actually pretty amusing. And Streiber insists that this turnaround of his focus in 1998 in the confirmation was the result of his conviction that there is sufficient hard evidence to prove the existence of the abduction phenomena that he's been writing about for 10 years. It is best to let the reader judge, as I say. So Streiber wraps up his account of implants by recalling those abductees who remember being tagged by aliens with the... Okay, so I've already read that. Never mind. For Streiber, as for many American UFO abductees, the pain and trauma of their reported experiences has become the touchstone of the real, the sign that something is deeply amiss in the land of the free and the brave. I'm having immense emotions of irony right now. Since for them, as for dominant American performed culture, pain does not lie, it follows that there is a cause, an agent, a source for the pain, for the experience of being captured, of being marked, of being haunted by the uncertainty due to personal encounter with one's own seeming helplessness in the face of a force or forces which display technological superiority that do not feel as we do, and yet are intimately bound up in our lives and may or may not display human faces. For those of us who study, those few of us who study UFO abduction or the UFO contact community in the academy, the liminal politics of pain is a constant reminder of the limits of human epistemological understanding. Just as the woman in pain at the beginning of this essay sought to bridge the experiential gap between herself and her husband to the point of seeking her own individual abduction, as contactees and abductees come together in communities of support and painful testimony in defiance of public opinion and official derision, and as scholars attempt to unravel the intricate web of beliefs involved in these accounts, so we are brought to the boundary of fact, fiction, body, mind, and even pain and revelation. We are brought to a logical consequence of our beliefs in the power of experience, the body, embodied pain, as a sign of the real. To quote Mark Seltzer once again, quote, "One rediscovers here the familiar intersections of natural bodies and technologies, somatic and mechanical systems of circulation, a violent literalization of the analogies between bodies and technologies." Although he is talking about the construction of serial killers and we are discussing alien abductions, there is something about his analysis which holds. Both narratives are considered, whether fictional or real, to be performed acts, when they are shared, of abduction, capture, violence, and violation. Both involve the deliberate infliction, in fact or fiction, of examination, mutilation, the marking of flesh, or the removal of samples, keepsakes, or sexual assault. And this is nothing about the fascination with both narratives, fictional and fact, in the American cultural media marketplace. Can I really dismiss the concerns of the woman in pain when a seemingly normal, according to the narrative of serial killers, human being in my own town can arrange for a capture, examination, and torture session that is even more diabolical? In the liminal politics of pain, the truth often becomes that which hurts the most.